Hi everyone, welcome to our Fireside chat. It's so warm this evening. I hope that we could maybe call it the poolside chat, but we don't have a pool or a fireplace at our house. But we are glad that you are here. We hope that this time is memorable and informative as we talk today about the upcoming election and the election that just happened. Our special guest tonight is Jeff Blaylock, happens to be a close relative of mine, and he is also the publisher of Texas Election Source. Jeff is a veteran campaign manager, press secretary, and policy advisor for numerous political campaigns in Texas and other states. He has a very impressive body of work, including that he has developed the most comprehensive data set on straight ticket voting in the state of Texas, and a robust model indicating primary challenge risk. I'll let Jeff tell you a little bit more about himself.
All right, thank you for having me. And this counts as a day, by the way.
Probably.
So I've been publishing Texas Election Source since 2014. It is a subscriber-supported website newsletter that looks at Texas politics and elections. And this is, of course, an election year and a fairly consequential one, not only for the state, but for the country and perhaps even the world. And so this website is really designed to just provide the key information about political trends in Texas, about key election races, about campaign finance results, and then we also use our tools and our models to project what we think is going to happen in the election. We just released our latest projections on Sunday night, and I think for many of the folks who are watching in the congregation, they may like some of what they might hear about those new projections.
Great. Let's move your cup just in case it's
Sure.
right in the middle of the picture.
We'll move this out of the way.
So there's one question on everybody's mind, at least everybody that's probably watching this fireside chat tonight. So we're just going to open big.
Okay, let's go.
Is Texas about to turn blue?
You know, asking a political guy that question is sort of like asking a college football fan, is Texas back? And that may have cut too close to some of you, so I apologize. Is Texas turning blue is a question on a couple of axes, right? You have just the immediate result of this upcoming election in that will the Democrats do well enough to either retake the lower house for Joe Biden to win the state as a presidential candidate? And then there's a longer term question of, if that were to happen, is that going to be the steady state going forward? I think the answer to the first question is maybe, and the second question is probably not yet. Since 1998, I have been, come on. This is my intern. He helps run our models and calculate our numbers for us. His name is Maxwell. Since 1998, we've been hearing about demographic changes in the state, and that was going to restore power to the Democratic Party. It hasn't happened in all this time, but I think we are starting to get there. Hispanics and Latinos will surpass the white population sometime in the next year, according to the state demographer. 2/3 of Texans aged 18 to 24 now are non-white, compared to just 39% of Texans who are 65 and older. And 2 non-white Texans become old enough to vote for every 1 white Texan who becomes old enough to vote. Now, white voters still turn out more and at a higher rate than non-white voters, particularly Hispanics and Latinos, but we're seeing a greater movement toward younger voters participating and making it a habit to vote. They came out for Beto O'Rourke 2 years ago, and at least in Travis County, in the special election we just had, young voters under 40, made up about 47% of the electorate, which is a very, very high number for that group in the state.
Do you want to mention the overall turnout in the last election, last week?
I do want to mention that. I have to flip to where that data is. We had more votes cast in the Democratic runoff, not quite 1 million. It's the most that have been cast since 1990. And for those of you who've been around, 1990 was, of course, the runoff between then Treasurer Ann Richards and then Attorney General Jim Maddox for the gubernatorial nomination. Now, more votes were cast in the Democratic runoff this year than in 2014, 2016, and 2018 combined. 6% of registered voters cast ballots in that runoff, which is the highest for the Democrats since 1994, which again was the last year that a Democrat was elected statewide. There were about 610,000 people who voted in the Republican runoff. It's a little harder to know for sure what that number is because there was no statewide runoff. And so the state doesn't capture that data. So we had to go county by county to get there. That is the third highest in state history for the Republicans. And the combined runoff vote total was the highest since 1972. So a lot to be excited about from a turnout standpoint. But it's still an abysmally low turnout. It just happens to be boffo turnout for a runoff election.
Right.
So a lot to look at there and say there's more interest certainly now in voting in these elections than there has been before. I meant to pull this exact number, so I may flub this factually. So please fact check me. But my guess is that more people voted for Krista Castaneda in the Railroad Commission runoff for the Democrats approximately than voted for the Democratic runoff for governor 2 years ago. Give or take, a few tens of thousands of votes, but about that magnitude is where we're looking at this year.
Wow.
So, very good.
So what would it take for a Democrat to win Texas?
Well, there's really just two ways that you can get there, right? You either have to bring new voters into the equation who are on Team Blue, or you have to win converts from Team Red. A lot of energy has been spent in recent election cycles on creating new voters, and a lot of that energy has been spent in terms of new voter registrations. The problem with that is that's not enough. Just registering someone to vote doesn't get them actually to come out to the polls. What we found in 2018 was that people who, and it's been true for years, is that people who vote regularly are more likely to vote the next time. And so 96% of the folks who voted in the last four primaries in 2018 voted in that general election. But only 20% of registered voters with no recent voting history turned out. So for every 5 new people that were registered to vote in 2018, only one of them actually showed up on average. And so that energy toward voter registration is not simply enough. It makes it actually more important, particularly in this climate with the president and the White House being such a polarizing force in politics today, to win over converts. And converts actually count twice. They literally count as 2 votes. They're +1 on your side, and they're -1 on the other side, and that's 2. So for every convert you went over, you've essentially picked up 2 votes on the other side. So whatever that gap is, you need half of it to come over to your side, and you've caught them.
So in your opinion, what do you see are the biggest issues heading into this coming election?
Well, in January, I would have said Trump, and Trump were the biggest issues heading into this election, driving both turnout for Team Red and for Team Blue. I would say now we can really narrow that scope further, and it is Trump and the federal government's handling, and to some extent the state government's handling of the coronavirus outbreak, pandemic, and Black Lives Matter. Now, in particular, when we're looking at younger voters, especially that Black Lives Matter situation, the response to it, and then also the Republicans doubling down on defending Confederate monuments, I think is going to be an important driver to younger turnout, whereas the coronavirus outbreak handling is more for older voters who are concerned about watching relatives become sick or losing relatives and friends because of the virus response. So I know Trump was planning on running on a strong economy. Those were the messages coming out at the beginning of the year. That's not going to happen now. And then he was counting on really big, rambunctious rallies to boost his side's turnout and to really hone his attacks on Joe Biden. And that's not probably going to happen either. We saw in Tulsa a few weeks ago, the president had his first big rally since the pandemic started, and he played to a nearly empty arena. And that sort of an outcome may continue to happen as he goes out on the road.
Yeah. I remember talking with you at the time about Beto O'Rourke's chances in 2018, and you were not optimistic about his chances.
No.
But he did come close to beating Ted Cruz. What do you see in the race between MJ Hagar and John Cornyn this year?
Yeah, so I wasn't really optimistic because I knew that O'Rourke needed to put together a coalition of young voters and suburban women voters and educated voters that just had not previously existed in Texas. And it turns out he got most of the way there, but not all the way there. I said going into that election that O'Rourke needed about 10% of Greg Abbott's voters to also vote for O'Rourke. And in a state where 70% of voters cast a straight party ballot, that essentially meant 4 out of every 9 people who didn't cast a straight party ballot and voted for Abbott would have to vote for O'Rourke. And that's just a number that's pretty much unattainable. But he did get pretty close. O'Rourke got the most votes that any Democrat has ever gotten in Texas in any year. Turnout for that election in 2018 was much higher than typically occurs in a mid-year election. Typically in Texas, turnout from a previous presidential election drops between 30 and 40%. In 2018, it was just 7%. So a tremendous amount of interest that I believe is both a combination of O'Rourke's magnetism to younger voters and a reaction to the first 2 years of the Trump presidency. Mm-hmm. 2018 was also the first time the Democrats gained seats in the Texas legislature in a midterm election since 2006. And those of you who remember 2010 know what a disastrous year that was. They lost 24 seats in the House alone. They've gotten about half of those back, and we think there's a chance they'll get a lot of the rest of them back this year. So what MJ Hagar, to answer your actual question, what MJ Hagar needs to do is she needs to find the fundraising prowess that O'Rourke had, not as prolifically, but she still needs a lot of money. She needs to rekindle his followers' fire. And if I were advising her personally, I would just tell her that you just need to be a badass. You need to be who you are. Beto is unapologetically a badass guy. You need to be an unapologetically badass woman and take it to a senator in Cornyn who's not as disliked as Cruz in the state, but also not as liked. John Cornyn today is still polling in the mid to upper 30s, which is really remarkable for someone who's been in statewide elected office for a generation. He was the Supreme Court Justice, he was a 2-term Attorney General, and he's now been in the United States Senate for 18 years. And yet, still, a third of likely voters are undecided in the race. And in a recent poll, 40% of voters had no opinion on Cornyn's job performance.
Huh.
I mean, imagine having been in office for 18 years and 2/5 of voters don't have an opinion about you.
So, what else are the polls telling you?
What we're seeing is a significant gender gap, just like we saw in 2018. In a recent University of Texas poll, men favored Donald Trump by 12 points and women favored Joe Biden by 5 points. And my guess is that the number of women supporting Biden is going to inch upward as we get closer to November. Trump's job performance is strongly disliked by more than 40% of Texans, women more than 45%. That's not just disliked, that is strongly disliked. And what we've seen in compared to 2016 about this time is an erosion of support in some key demographics for Trump. In 2016, Trump was plus 27 among independent voters. He is plus 2 in recent polling here in Texas. Among high school graduates, voters whose high school was their top education attainment, he was plus 16 in 2016. He's plus 10 now. Suburban residents, plus 12 4 years ago, plus 4 now. And even voters 65 and older, although he's still doing very well among them, he was plus 33. He's now just plus 25. And all of those little shifts can add up to a fairly significant number. There's also a couple of nuggets I found really interesting in the last couple of weeks. They are polls by Fox News, who we all know is fairly out to the right, and then One America News Network, who is really far out to the right. The Fox News poll had Biden up by 1. The One America News poll had Trump up by 2 in Texas. And so those are outfits that you would think would have fairly friendly polling numbers for the president. And so if those are friendly, the state's very close. If those are realistic, which they may very well be, that's where we are. The other thing I would point to is that in 2016, at no point in 2016, was Hillary Clinton polling ahead of Trump. And we've seen now 3 polls where Biden is ahead, 2 of them within the margin of error. But still, that is a shift from 2016 that we didn't see then.
How are you feeling about the special election for Kurt Watson's seat?
We just saw new numbers today from Travis County. Former County Judge Sarah Eckhart still below 50%, so we are going to have a runoff between her and Representative Eddie Rodriguez. We figured that's probably what would have happened based on the demographics and the political leanings of that district. Eddie has work to do. He's fairly far behind, but it is possible for him to overcome that deficit. What Eckhart's pretty strong performance tells me is that voters generally were okay with her resigning from the top office in Travis County in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic and the county's response to that, and did not take that out on her in the ballot box. And so as I look toward that runoff, Eckhart, who was elected countywide, there have been more voters within the Senate district who have voted for Eckhart than have ever voted for Rodriguez. And so she does have the advantage in that sense. It's really going to be up to Eddie to see how he can chisel away at what was a nearly 16-point deficit in the first round of voting. Good news for Eddie is the first round of voting now no longer counts.
Right. Do you have any concerns about the COVID-19's impact on the upcoming election?
Oh, yes, very much. I just saw last night out of McLennan County, which is where Waco is, that another 3 poll workers who worked at a particular polling station in the town of McGregor, just outside of Waco, have been diagnosed with COVID-19, and that brings that number up to higher than 3. So I'm concerned about them in particular, not just those specific individuals, so I hope fully recover, but poll workers generally in the state of Texas are at-risk groups. They are either over the age of 65, they have some form of a disability, they're on SSI, or some combination of things that makes them particularly vulnerable. And so what concerns me going into November is that we may see not enough people to work polls, and we will have to close polling locations on very little notice. And that has a tendency to really hurt turnout in those areas. And it's not hard to see, particularly in counties where the administration of the election is not partisan blind, that the poll locations that may be closed are going to be the ones that would advantage the other party. So I'm concerned about that. I'm concerned about long lines because of a very high interest in the election. We did eliminate single punch straight party voting, which I think is going to have a number of different effects, but one of the largest is it's going to take longer for people to vote. I'm hopeful that Governor Abbott will extend the early voting period for the general election, as he did for the primary runoff election, by another week or so. And I would expect some record absentee ballots, because those are ballots by mail, because of the pandemic, and that could end up delaying results, particularly in close races on election night.
So this is a question you and I have talked about, but I'm not sure that a lot of people have thought to ask themselves or their friends this. Do you think we'll know who won the presidential election night on that election night? Or are we in for another Florida in 2000 kind of situation?
We could be in for a Florida in 2000 times several states situation, depending on how the elections go across the country. If we don't have a clear electoral college winner that causes all of the states that are within a fraction of a point of the candidates of each other coming into play. We're already seeing certainly the Trump campaign and himself in tweets already raising the specter that this election is going to be rigged, that mail ballots are going to be fraudulent, that the only reason he's going to lose is because millions of votes were illegally cast against him and not because the majority of the country despises him, which is what the polling data suggests. So if someone doesn't have that clear majority, we could be in for not just a long night, but a long couple of months. You'll recall 2000 went into December before we had a definitive answer. And even then, it's unclear that the current president would accept those results come January when the new term is supposed to begin. And so that's even in the best of years, elections work best when there's a clear winner and a clear loser. When it's very close, like even the runoff we've just had in Congressional District 23 on the Republican side, one person is ahead of the other by 7 votes. And we're still counting provisional ballots and mail-in ballots, and then there'll still be recounts. And so that drags out in the best of circumstances, and this election is not going to have those best circumstances.
Right. So while we're talking about election night, what are your predictions?
I predict it'll be a late night, but I do predict, as I said, we have a model that we use to try to project how the districts are going to look at the end of election night. And these take into account the partisan trends in these districts for 20 years. We go all the way back to the 2002 elections. And generally speaking, if you take out the wobble in the state from year to year between, say, a presidential year and a non-presidential year, you actually find a lot of these districts are on a fairly linear path of either becoming redder or bluer. And just about as many go bluer as go redder across the state. So what we're projecting is we will have turnout above 60% for the first time since 1988. We will have a record number of voters cast ballots approaching and possibly exceeding 10 million, which means that 6 million who are registered still won't vote, and another 2.5 million people who are eligible still won't register. So that's still 8.5 million people who could be in the process, probably won't be. We're projecting Trump to carry the state by 2.5 points at just barely over 50%. John Cornyn winning by less than 3 points, barely over 50%. A congressional delegation where the Democrats pick up 3 seats. We're projecting CD 22 in Fort Bend County, CD 23 in South and West Texas, and CD 24 in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. We project the Democrats will pick up 1 seat in the state Senate, that is SD 19, which is in South and West Texas. That would be a course correction from a special election a few years ago. And perhaps most importantly to this audience, we are projecting the Democrats will pick up 6 seats in the state house. They need 9 to get a majority, but we're projecting they will get 6 of those. And that will actually leave in Dallas County no Republicans serving in the legislature for the upcoming session. The two remaining House districts they have there, we think, are going to flip in this election.
Wow, it's been a long time.
It's been a long time.
What can progressives do to keep us from another 4 years of our current political leadership?
Well, vote, first of all.
Vote
a way to avoid that if that's what you want. If you want 4 more years, obviously vote that way as well. You know, in the past, and some of you who have heard me give presentations to the church or to Sunday schools have said, you know, I've always asked you to find 10 friends and ask them what their plans are to vote, when they're going to vote, where they're going to vote, what time of day they're planning on voting. Follow up with them the day before and make sure they're still going to do it, and then follow up afterward to make sure they did it. And if they don't, repeat the questions. What are the plans? I think for this year, for progressives, let's make it 25 people. Let's really spend some effort to turn those registered voters into actual voters and find friends. You can look up the voter files and see who did and who didn't vote in 2018 and see which of your friends did and didn't, and ask them about it this year. Certainly consider volunteering to work at a polling place if you feel safe doing so. I think we are going to have a shortage of poll workers, and so the more that we have, the smoother election day will be for voters. And I think, too, you can have a very big impact on down ballot races. The presidential race is going to take a lot of the oxygen out of the room. We just had a round of campaign fundraising where Governor Greg Abbott has got a cash on hand number of about $38 million. That is more than every Republican candidate on the ballot this year for the legislature has, and every congressional candidate on the ballot this year for Congress has. So a lot of money tied up in races not on the ballot. But you can have a really big impact down the ballot by giving small donations and connecting digitally to candidates. COVID-19, we thought, was going to have a really hard and difficult impact on campaigns to be able to raise money. It turns out that the candidates who adopted an online platform are doing very well. Act Blue is the platform of choice for progressives and for Democratic candidates. You can find a number of candidates running here and elsewhere in Texas that you can support. And those small dollar donations, they add up. They added up for O'Rourke. They're adding up for Joe Biden. They will add up for MJ Hagar and any other candidates that you choose to support on Team Blue. Team Red has their own structure and system. Not as advanced as the Democrats, as we've seen. Their forays into digital have not been quite as successful, but they're getting there.
I want to thank you for your time and for talking with me tonight. If you want more information or want to see this information, Jeff gave you a lot of information very, very quickly. You can email me and we'll figure out how to get that to you if you're interested in some of those statistics that he quoted. Is that okay with you?
That'd be great.
And again, I want to thank you and appreciate you. And good night, everybody.
Thank you. Good night.